Hello, my name is Grant Parker. I teach African Studies and Classics at Stanford University. I would like to take on the topic, what is heritage? Because it seems to me heritage is a very important topic for many people in different parts of the world. It is worth our while to try to get an understanding of just what is at stake with this concept of heritage. In an obvious sense, we could think of heritage as the presence of the past. That is to say, what remains to us today from earlier times, perhaps what we might choose to preserve for future generations. That much is not very disputed, but in fact, we quickly come to a series of questions that pose problems for the effective definition of heritage. Here are just a few questions, or what we might call heritage frictions. Firstly, who benefits from heritage? Whose perspective counts? How might national and global or even other priorities be balanced? How can consensus be built around heritage matters between rich and poor nations or between countries that are politically adrift? How might we mitigate the impact of war? Because, of course, if an international agreement is in place that no longer holds in circumstances of war, such as we are seeing at this point in 2024. Is heritage a private or a public good? Or at least, what are the tensions between public and private notions of heritage? And finally, which kinds of medium are involved beyond the tangible idea of an object or of a place or of a building, as opposed to intangible heritage, which has become more and more part of the heritage scenario. Let us start with UNESCO. UNESCO is an international body linked to the United Nations. In fact, it was founded shortly after the founding of the United Nations. And we can find in the UNESCO World Heritage website a definition of just what heritage is. And it begins, heritage is our legacy from the past, what we live with today, and what we pass on to future generations. Our cultural and natural heritage are both irreplaceable sources of life and inspiration. That is not an official definition, but it strikes me as a very useful starting point, emphasizing that heritage is a good that has all kinds of impact in the way people's identities are formed, in the way people see the world, in the way the we of that very sentence is formed. Here you see a map of the sites that have been declared World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. And this is the list as of 2024. You will note from the different colors of the map that there are different kinds of heritage sites. Some are natural heritage sites, others are cultural, and a third group are mixed natural and cultural. You will also note from this map that the vast majority are in Western Europe, and in fact, Italy, Spain, and France have a very large number of World Heritage Sites, whereas other countries have few or none at all. And in fact, you can see a very uneven distribution across the continents of the world. There are many, many different reasons for that. But it is worth noting that this definition of World Heritage that we've just seen seems to fit best for the examples that are indicated on this map, leaving the problem of how to deal with cases that do not fall into that, or in cases in which there are difficulties in getting the UN recognition, which brings resources and brings some degree of protection to sites thus declared. A word about UNESCO. UNESCO was founded in 1946. Its early success was around the Nubian campaign. That is an attempt to rescue sites from the changing water level on the Nile in 1959 at the time that Lake Nasser was being built. UNESCO saw the or through the 1970 Convention on the Illicit Trafficking of Cultural Objects. That was very major legislation that led to a sea change in the freedom with which objects, cultural objects, or objects of cultural value crossed international lines. Suddenly there were impediments to the illegal trade of antiquities that affected so many countries throughout the 19th and 20th century and into the 21st century. Technically, the 1970 Convention is a control on the international movement of goods of cultural value. Other legislation followed. A big move came in 2003 with the Intangible Heritage Convention. That meant that the effective idea of heritage moved from objects and places and concrete objects to intangible objects. So that might have meant skills, it might have meant the making of certain craft work, it might have meant singing practices, it might have meant all kinds of objects that have not necessarily any material expression at all. Though not UNESCO's own work, but closely linked, it came in 2007, shortly after, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And this meant that the perspectives and the interests of Indigenous people were much more strongly safeguarded as of this point. So to give you an example of the definition of intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO, here we find, again, an unofficial definition, and it reflects the attempt to move beyond monuments and objects. Certainly the initial impetus was around monuments and objects. But with intangible cultural heritage, we move beyond that. We move instead to traditional, contemporary practices, including some that are existent at our very own time. The mood of this is inclusive, and it emphasizes communities rather than state actors as a whole. Intangible cultural heritage also meant job creation for many people that possessed these skills that were covered by intangible cultural heritage. So many governments saw this as a new opportunity for job creation and economic potential. An example of heritage in this country might come with the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and particularly Black History Month. Black History Month has its early origins in 1926, but only became, under Gerald Ford, recognized on a more official basis in 1976. And here we have an exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture to celebrate Black History Month. A great deal of the frictions around heritage have to do with repatriation. Who owns an object? If an object shows up in X country, does it belong to that country? And what happens if the borders of that country change? What happens if the sovereignty of that country changes? A classic case that has been much in the news for many years is the Parthenon frieze at the Parthenon, the large temple to Athena on top of the Acropolis in Athens. They used to be known as the Elgin marbles because it was Lord Elgin, Thomas Bruce, who had them moved from Athens when Greece was under Ottoman control, and they have been at the British Museum since then. These marble friezes at the British Museum, some of them are in other museums and some of them are still in Athens, but those in the British Museum in London have been the subject of intense international debate, with the Greek government and many others calling for their return. And here we see, in the slide on the right, a replica of a British Museum piece that has been placed back in its original site in the Parthenon in Athens. Resistance to the repatriation call has come in the form of what is called the Encyclopedic Museum, or sometimes the Universal Museum. In other words, major collectors, so major museums in the global north, the Metropolitan, the Louvre, the British Museum, and many others, including ones in this country, have defended their in large collections, many with the majority of objects having been collected before 1970. They've defended them against repatriation claims by appealing to the concept of the Encyclopedic Museum. This Encyclopedic Museum is supposedly the property of all humankind, and so all of the world's population is invited to come to London or New York or whatever the case may be to inspect this world heritage for which that museum is the custodian. That clearly is a different approach compared to the claims of individual countries which have lost a great deal of their objects in wartime or even outside of war. And here is an example in Austria, what used to be the Landesmuseum Johanneum in Graz, Austria, has now been called the Universalmuseum Johanneum. So this too, in its different branches, claims to be an encyclopedic museum, even though it is strongly based on Austrian property, yet it presents itself as a world asset. Hyperreality is a new entrant into this, and so you can see on the slide on the left a recreation of the flooding of St. Mark's in Venice. This is a warning against the impact of rising tides and its impact on St. Mark's in Venice in particular. And on the right we find a half-size replica of the arch at Palmyra that was destroyed. And so both of these uses of hyperreality serve to show what dangers are posed by current conditions, whether war or climate change. To some degree, hyperreality can restore things that are no longer in existence. But of course, that loses a sense of authenticity. I have a few examples from South Africa because that is the area of my research. The initial effort to preserve cultural heritage in South Africa focused on the rock art of the indigenous San people, whom the early Europeans called Bushmen. But soon that transitioned to the preservation of European architecture, and that's when the National Monuments Council was created. And this dates back to South Africa's colonial and apartheid times. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, there has been a strong emphasis on the struggle against apartheid as something to represent in museums. There's also been a strong move, this is part of a global movement, towards intangible heritage, and this brings into play a much broader range of the South African population. In general, there's also a move towards decolonization and to indigenous knowledge systems. The idea that South African past should not be exhibited, should not be understood purely through a European or a Eurocentric lens, that African perspectives should be part of the heritage equation as well. And here's an example. The South African National Gallery was founded in 1930 in central Cape Town, and you can see its classical proportions. In its transition after the end of apartheid, traditional artistic styles of the indigenous Nguni people were added to the facade. This is something of a band-aid solution to the question of heritage. Meanwhile, the contents of the museum have also changed. The South African National Gallery for many decades collected no art whatsoever of black artists. But that has changed, and nowadays the art that's on display in the gallery shows a much more varied range of South African artists. South African art, if that is the right term, goes back many thousands of years to the rock art of the San people. Some of this is still on site in different parts of South Africa, wherever the San people lived, in caves. And so here we have an example at the top of your screen. Some has been brought to the South African Museum, or the Iziko South African Museum as it's now called. This is a question of what role the museum can play. It is best, obviously, for cultural assets to remain in place, but that limits the degree to which people are able to see the material, and it also exposes that material to danger. Within a museum that is a curated space, it's able to show a great deal in a small space, in a more central location. It's important, I think, to see that there are different narratives at play here. So if you look at the slide on the right, that is Freedom Park. It's one of the post-apartheid museums. This is much less about objects that are displayed in the museum on site, but much more a sense of invoking a broad narrative of African past, a narrative of South Africa in a setting of the African continent. And that is the main goal of Freedom Park. And you can see the use of stones here with the burning of a fire of religious significance is part of a generation of cultural heritage. We have a very different kind of heritage on a much smaller scale. In the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, very popular with tourists, I think because it has a very vivid sense of individual people's lives. You will not find individual life stories in Freedom Park. You have a broad sweep over several thousand years of South African history. In the District 6 Museum, you will find a sense of what people's lives were like, and in an area that was bulldozed under racial zoning. And here we have in the image on the left a reconstruction of the barber shop, which is center of social life. So this is a different kind of heritage. It tells a different story at a different register. To end, let's return to the heritage frictions we mentioned earlier by identifying some of the criteria that we might need to define the very slippery, important, tricky notion of heritage. We should recognize, to begin with, that there are different registers of heritage between the global, the national, the ethnic, regional, local, and personal. And these can overlap. So there are different registers of heritage, and all of these have a claim to the title. It is worth bearing in mind that all of these have their own different kinds of material. They tell their own very different kinds of story. Heritage is typically seen as a public property, something belonging to a group, a we, and of course that we, as we've seen, can be differently defined. But it competes with the private market, and in fact this is an ongoing difficulty. The illicit trade in cultural property is a mortal danger to heritage per se. Thirdly, we have to recognize that the economics involved in heritage are of great significance. Heritage is a potential source of income for many people. At the same time, it is possible for exploitation to happen. Many indigenous communities are exploited if, for example, their goods are purchased at a low price and then resold at a very high price somewhere else. The economics of heritage are always in the background at every level, from the individual to government and international level. There is an economics around the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Fourth, the relation between rich and poor nations is very intense around this. The different nations, whether they are source countries from which cultural objects are continued to be taken or have been taken on a massive scale in previous times, such as in Egypt, there is an intense conflict really between collecting countries, as it were, and providing countries in the heritage sphere. Fifth, they are both material elements of heritage. The traditional kind of heritage has to do with objects and with sites and with architecture. But intangible heritage is increasingly part of the heritage scene and needs to be viewed as such. So the heritage discourse is broadening in response to intangible heritage, not only in South Africa, but in many countries. Finally, heritage looks both backwards and forwards. It involves some engagement with the past, with earlier traditions, with earlier objects, with early ideas even, but it is that which is done in the present and is very often done with a view to the future, an attempt to curate the cultural property of our times for future generations. Thank you.